we want to welcome you to this session with Vincent Sliwoski. He's a partner, program co-chair and partner with Harris Bricken, which, if you were with us on the last session, you already know is one of the biggest firms based in Seattle, specializing in structuring and get going cannabis industry, and also all sorts of corporate and legal services in the US, based in the US, and partner with Logic and specifically in the cannabis industry, Mexican cannabis industry. Vince he runs the firm's Oregon office, and his clients run through the gamut from individual investors to entrepreneurs and widely held domestic and international corporations. Since 2011, he has represented a large number of cannabis entities through corporate structuring, commercial transaction, and early stage dispute resolution. Vince, it is an honor to be here with you and to share the mic and camera.
Thanks so much for having me, you guys. That's a really generous introduction. I appreciate it. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, so close to Seattle. I'm in the northwest of the U.S. For those of you who aren't from the U.S., it's just above California and just below Seattle. But yeah, I've been doing this stuff for a long time, for 10 years, and watching the Mexican cannabis rollout developments for a long time. It was funny, leading up to this presentation, I was looking at old articles and things. I found one I wrote in 2015 when you guys had your very first landmark Supreme Court decision saying that cannabis use was a right of the individual and was kind of a precursor to legalization that we're now seeing roll out all these years later. So it's been fun tracking it, and it's fun being here. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Vince. Let's start with that. I mean, you talked about 2015, which was the one of the first judicial precedents we have here in Mexico, and then in 2017, the medical marijuana in Mexico became legal, although not fully regulated. And then today, 2021, January the 12th, finally, we have full regulations here in Mexico. Tell us about how did that impact in the US, concretely in a specialist like yourself. How was it lived? Was it a big deal with you, the firm, and also with the clients? Was it felt as Mexico interesting for the US market?
Well, yeah, I think, US, including a lot of our clients, have definitely been watching really closely what's happening in Mexico, because it is such a big market, and because so many people do have relationships there outside the cannabis world, or neighbor countries, other businesses operate on a cross-border basis. And the US is now kind of in a cannabis sandwich, if you will, with Canada above the US having legalized federally a couple of years back, and Mexico now with its program of federal legalization imminent. In the US is kind of in this awkward spot where it's legalized at the state level in many places, but not yet quite federally. So yeah, we've been watching developments really closely. I watched, for instance, the US MCA trade agreement that was adopted. When was that? About a year ago. They're sometimes called NAFTA 2.0, and I was interested to see its impact on the potential cannabis trade, especially when the US comes around and legalizes federally. So short answer is just high level, a lot of watching and waiting and teeing up for what is going to be a lot of cross-border investment and trade, especially as we see how the cannabis program is being set up in Mexico with respect to allowance of foreign investment, things like that.
Great. And one of the questions that's raised, one of the concerns that raises is what will happen if Mexico legalizes federally, but the US doesn't? I mean, beforehand, we know that there won't be able to be much trading between countries. And you talked about the MTA, but let's talk about this.
What about status?
Yeah, what's the current status in the US in regards to federal legalization? We've heard that maybe that could happen in this administration. Even there were even some voices that said maybe in this year, but really we want to know your perspective and what do you see?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And I think maybe just taking a step back, I should really clarify that when I answer the questions today, we're talking about the cannabis that we call marijuana under federal law, under our Controlled Substances Act, and not cannabis hemp, right? Which is defined as cannabis with THC at 0.3% threshold by a dry weight or higher, because that trade is legal right now. The hemp trade is legal right now. You could have hemp coming and going from the US to Mexico. And you can also have some limited trade in terms of approved pharmaceutical drugs. Like we do have a cannabis drug that's been approved by the FDA called Epidiolex in the US, and that theoretically could come in under USMCA and make its way into Mexican markets by virtue of whatever pharmaceutical licensing regime there is. So that's kind of a side point. But what I want to say is I'm talking about marijuana here. And when you're asking me these questions, I'm going to answer about marijuana. And I will tell you the status of marijuana federally and the prospects of it per your question. So I think to answer the question, it's important to start with a high level statement, which is that marijuana is illegal under federal law. It's totally illegal. And it's been like that for a long time. The current regime has been in place for pretty much exactly 50 years. In 1971, the United States adopted the Federal Controlled Substances Act. That was President Richard Nixon at that time. And what that Controlled Substances Act did is had schedules of drugs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the Schedule 1 is the most, I guess, dangerous drugs, for lack of a better way to say it. It's a designation slapped on substances with no approved medical use and a high potential for abuse. And marijuana is put in that schedule. So in the US, federally, marijuana is treated similarly as fentanyl or cocaine or methamphetamine or all these truly dangerous drugs that truly kill people. So although cannabis remains a Schedule 1 drug, it's not treated that way from a prosecutorial standpoint. We have an amendment to our spending bills that gets renewed every year. It's called the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment, named after one of the congressmen from here in my state that we talk to a lot, by the way. And it prohibits federal prosecution of individuals as long as they're complying with their state medical cannabis laws. It doesn't protect people from prosecution if they're adult use cannabis businesses or adult use cannabis market participants. But the medical use in a lot of these states is legal with the doctor's recommendation. I think we have about 35 states now that have a medical marijuana program, which is obviously out of step with federal law, as well as I think 4 of the 5 US territories now have medical marijuana. The District of Columbia has medical marijuana. That's a district with a special status. It's not a state. And then in 14 states, we have recreational use of cannabis legal, and that's changing fast, and that number of states is growing. If you guys have been reading the news this week, New York has been in the news all week. They're very close to passing adult use legislation. There are a couple of other states close behind. And overall, if you look across the country at the 50 states, there are really only 2 states left with a total prohibition regime where marijuana is illegal for any use whatsoever. Those states are Idaho and Nebraska, incidentally. But I guess when you think about this question, is marijuana legal in the US? It's kind of you have to think about it in 2 ways. First, you have to think about it at the federal level and the state level, because we have a dual sovereignty regime in the US. But then you also have to think about, what does it even mean for cannabis to be legal in all these states where it's legal? Because it's treated a lot differently in every state. Some states, when you move over from prohibition, they have very, very limited decriminalization stuff. And some other states are a little more progressive with limited medical programs. Then other states are more progressive with wide open medical programs. And then you get over here to these adult use programs where cannabis is generally treated almost like beer or liquor at the state level. So I can answer you guys a little bit about where we're going with federal legalization if you're interested in that, but that's kind of the state of it right now.
Yeah. Yes. As you talked earlier, as you said earlier, hemp and hemp-derived CBD is or could be subject to trading between countries. That is interesting for Mexico. The thing is, since we don't define hemp the same way, not just yet, that's a barrier on our side. But in order for both countries to be able to trade marijuana, THC, psychedelic, psychoactive, and the full extent of power of the plant, there has to be a federal legalization. Please walk us through. What do you see? What's the path? Where are you going on that regards?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a billion trillion dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to speculate a little bit here, as everybody will have to do who talks about this topic, but I'm going to give you some informed speculation. And so I think obviously Joe Biden is the president of the United States right now. Kamala Harris is the vice president. The Democrats have an extremely slim majority in the Senate. They have 50 senators. The Republicans have 50 senators, but the Democrats have a tie-breaking vote, and the tie-breaking vote is Kamala Harris. And then they have a pretty slim majority also in the House of Representatives. They have about 10 extra seats there. So top down, how does Biden think about marijuana legalization? Well, he's back in the day in the 80s and 90s, he was in the old school sort of drug warrior perspective of never wanting to legalize cannabis and treating it like a dangerous drug as a status quo under federal law. During his primary campaign last year, he didn't support the federal legalization of recreational marijuana. And we do a write-up of all the candidates on our blog, and we gave him a D. Like, we gave some candidates an A and some a B and a C, and he did just about the worst. He got a D. But during the general election campaign, he sort of shifted his tone, and he stated that marijuana should be decriminalized, which is a big step, and that maybe states should decide whether to legalize it for recreational use. Then he teamed up with Kamala Harris and picked her for his vice president on the ticket. Vice President Harris has come a long way on cannabis over the years, and today she's a big advocate of legalization, decriminalization. She said, we will decriminalize marijuana. We will expunge records for those who've been convicted of marijuana-related crimes, et cetera. And she, as a senator, was a sponsor of what's called the MORE Act, which was a bill to do all of these things to comprehensively legalize marijuana at the federal level. So it's kind of good you have her. She's not, she doesn't make the decision. She's the vice president, but she's in the leadership team. As far as what the Senate is doing, the new majority leader, Senator Schumer, has explicitly discussed marijuana reform, and he's got a bill he's working on right now today with a couple of other senators, made legalization part of his criminal justice reform priorities. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has continuously advanced marijuana reform legislation. So everybody, it's not official Democratic policy plank in the party, but it seems like there are a lot of bills out there. People are pushing to do it. We have legislation introduced in the 116th Congress today. One of them is the MORE Act that I referenced. That's introduced by Harris and others, and that passed at the House in the last Congress, and that was a landmark vote. So the House of Representatives actually voted already in December to legalize cannabis nationwide, and then now that has to be reconciled with the Senate. So the Senate has their version of the MORE Act introduced. There are some other bills which probably have a little bit less momentum or a few less signatories. I think the one I just mentioned has something like 31 senators now signed on. It's going to need at least 50 and probably 60 to get to a floor vote, just because of these arcane rules we have with something called the filibuster. I'm not going to get into that here, but we have other legislation like the Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act that was introduced by Schumer, who I mentioned before, and Hakeem Jeffries. There's a Marijuana Justice Act, which has been around for a while, Senator Cory Booker and Barbara Lee. So there are a lot of these bills kind of floating around. There's more. I'm not even going to go through them and mention them all. And then there are sort of standalone pieces of legislation that wouldn't legalize cannabis comprehensively, but may happen before cannabis is legalized comprehensively. And the one I'm thinking of in particular when I talk about that is called the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act, I believe. It's just referred to usually as a Safe Banking Act. And that is designed specifically to address the problem that cannabis businesses face not being able to be banked in the way that other businesses are banked in the US, and not having financial institution accessibility the way that they generally should, without having to go through a lot of hoops and giving them more options. So that's kind of where we're at with all this stuff that's sort of floating around. Will any of this happen in the next 2 years before we have more elections and the House and the Senate are up for grabs again? I don't know. I'm a little bit pessimistic about it, not because the political wherewithal or will isn't there, but just because Biden has a big agenda. It's called Build Back Better. There are a lot of things that the Democratic Party has prioritized. The very first one, HR1, is voting rights, but then they've got other stuff that they really, really want to do, like infrastructure on down. And I think cannabis is kind of important, right? But I don't think it's at the level of some of those other sort of progressive planks in their party platform. And I just don't know if it will happen in the next 2 years. I think we may continue to putter along with more and more states legalizing, having this awkward dynamic where cannabis is literally legal almost everywhere on a state by state basis, but we still have the conflict in federal laws. That's my guess. Long answer, short question.
No, it's not a short question, it's a comprehensive question. And I want to frame it. Why do we make or formulate this particular question? And it is because many Mexican entrepreneurs and also big businessmen are also saying forward their side and their interest in the U.S. market, and they wanted to have a
biggest consumer in the world.
They wanted to have a timeline because it is believed. Mexico is seen. We just heard it earlier from New Frontier data as a potential exporting country, and of course we will be looking to the U.S. market, but we can't right now. We're willing to be able to do that, and so. Just to be clear, you're guessing that maybe it'll take a couple of years for the federal marijuana market in the U.S. to be legal and to open up to, in this case, imports from other countries?
That's what I'm guessing, and a couple things on that. I remember doing a what's called a CLE here in the U.S. for a group of lawyers in Oregon in like 2016. And they asked me, when do you think cannabis will be federally legal? And I thought about it for a while. And I said, if I have to pick a year, I'll say 2020. Well, 2020 is come and gone. And it seemed like, things were changing fast at that time. It seemed like policy was changing fast at that time. And it was. But there's just, to get over the hump at the federal level is hard. And if it doesn't happen in the next 2 years, maybe it won't happen 2 years after that if Republicans get the House. I just don't know. I just don't think anybody should be banking on cannabis being federally legal. And then when it does become legal, there's something else that we probably need to talk about, which is even if Canada has legalized cannabis federally, Mexico has legalized cannabis federally, and the US has legalized cannabis federally, it still may be not possible to freely trade between the countries. And the reason for that is international law. It's going to be interesting how the parties continue to think of their treaty obligations under international law. Right now, international law really only contemplates the free trading of medical cannabis, right? So to the extent that these parties are breaking their treaty obligations probably by legalizing cannabis federally, the next question for them is, do they want to go one step further and start trading cannabis across borders? I don't know the answer to that or how that's going to be dealt with in all of the legislation and how that's going to be dealt with in trade compacts like USMCA that I've mentioned, but complex, lot of stuff to think through, not just these countries' domestic laws, but their treaty obligations under international laws and trade pacts.
Yeah, that's simply great. Okay, let's move forward to a more corporate businesses related question, Vince. When we talk about commercial transactions in the US, you can have it inside a state, a concrete state where it's legal, or you can have it through different states where you have that legal opportunity. But when it comes to international commerce, international businesses between Mexico and the US, or let's not use Mexico because we don't have as of yet these kind of businesses, but what's the corporate structure that you would advise on a corporation in the US that wants to come to Mexico, or that Mexico can offer to a US based potential partner in regards to the structure and the interest that is that has the US citizen when he thinks of investing in Mexico?
Yeah, So I'm probably not I'd like to answer the question. I'm not the best person to answer the question just because I don't understand Mexican company structures and how I don't know if you guys have the equivalent, I guess, of US corporations and LLCs and all that. Adrian down there in our Mexico office would probably be best to answer that, or you guys might know best about how those vehicles are structured. What I do know is that yeah, I guess I would just sort of leave it at that. I don't know how to tell US people to invest in Mexican cannabis. I would leave that to you, smarter Mexican attorney.
No problem. But let's talk about the commercial transactions in itself.
Sure.
When we're talking about potential buying and selling, what do the US-based contracts look like? I mean, in regards to the industry, to cannabis industry, we know, for example, that what goes to the primary part of it, the planet itself, there's a lot more supply than demand. How has it been for these companies to be able to structure their business transactions and their contracts in regards to cannabis?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, good question. So I can tell you that each one is a snowflake in the sense that each one has to comply with the laws in the local jurisdiction where the business activity is occurring. So, you know, if you're making an investment into a California cannabis company, the contract may have to be tailored quite a bit differently or structured quite a bit differently than an investment in a Nevada cannabis company or an Oregon cannabis company. And, you know, a lot of them, each state has rules around who can own these businesses. A lot of them are more wide open than others. They have rules around how that ownership can be postured. They have ownership disclosure requirements at certain levels. Some are more onerous than others. And it really just gets down to what the laws are in the local jurisdiction. And that's kind of an interesting, we were talking a little bit earlier about what's going to happen when cannabis is legal federally. I often tell people you're still going to have to comply with all of these different state laws until they change, right? So if cannabis suddenly is a federally uncontrolled substance, if it's removed from the Federal Controlled Substances Act and you want to start doing cannabis business, you're still going to have to look at all of these cannabis programs, which are going to control the substance to some extent on a state level, just in a different way. But you're going to have to kind of go through and sort of understand the jurisdiction you're working in. It's not going to be like buying some other commodity product or investing in some other commodity product like apples or wheat or soybeans or something that's less heavily regulated by local jurisdictions. So I guess I would say the analysis really starts with where this business is functioning and where it's licensed.
That's great. And there's a question that we wanted to raise to you, to Vince. What is precisely what the Hemp Act allows for US-based citizens? Even a before question, can foreign citizen or a foreign entity get advantage from the Hemp Act? Does it allow only for US citizens or US corporations to work based on it? What is allowed with that act? Any and everything, or just some particular activities in regards to cannabis? Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, it's more in the vein of any and everything, like you said. It's pretty wide open. So the Farm Bill, it's called the 2018 Farm Bill, which legalized hemp in the United States. And what it did is it just removed anything that is 0.3% THC by dry weight or lower from federal control, right? So hemp is now treated like those other crops I just mentioned, answering the last question, apples or soybeans or wheat. It's just like any other commodity product, except for that there's some licensing that the local businesses have to undertake, usually at the state level. Usually they have to get some sort of a permit to grow hemp, say, with their state Department of Agriculture. But once they have that, they can freely they can take on any sort of investor they want. The investor can be from Mexico. I have not heard of a single state, I don't think, that has any sort of a residency requirement related to hemp businesses. Things for investors to watch out for is not so much a question of can I actually invest, because you can. It's more questions of, is this hemp business complying with certain laws? And the reason I say that is a lot of hemp businesses a lot of hemp growers in particular are growing hemp for one particular cannabinoid, and that's CBD. And the reason they're growing it for CBD is because CBD foods and beverages and products have become really popular. But the federal position on that, at least from the Food and Drug Administration, is that those products generally don't comply with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, meaning people shouldn't be adding CBD to candy bars and to soft drinks and things like that because of what we call something called, it's not, it doesn't qualify under something called the drug exclusion rule. So in short, if you're investing in a business that is saying, you know, we want to sell CBD beer or CBD soft drinks and stuff, you have to really think about, are we going to get in trouble? Is that business going to get in trouble under US domestic law? I think that's the big thing to look out for. Not so much can you invest or can you be a part of a business, but is the business compliant?
That's great. So, well, we've covered federal do's and don'ts in the US. We've covered a little bit of federal do's and don'ts here in Mexico, which is it only allows as of medical right now, and we might have the full opening probably this month. But you touch a subject, Vince, that has to do with jurisdiction, and we were talking off camera that maybe we could talk about dispute resolution. That is something that portrays contract law that will be the everyday basis for not only for corporations but for lawyers, Mexican lawyers, as to choose what could be, for example, the jurisdiction where they want to settle their disputes, their partnership disputes, their stakeholders disputes, and also the contract disputes with American corporations. I want to ask you, as if it was an advice, where in the US would be, in your opinion, the best jurisdiction to be chosen for these disputes, particularly in the early stage of the opening of the commercial relationship between both countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll preface it by saying I'm not a litigator. I don't do dispute resolution. I did some early in my career, and we do have a couple of cannabis litigators in the office, and we have a bunch of international litigators at this firm. So these ideas get batted around the law firm, and I'm conversant in it. I guess what I would say is, number one, if there's no concern with optics, then you've got more choices. And the reason I say that is in the old days, at least as recently as 2-3 years ago, people were really, really, really concerned with cannabis disputes coming into the public purview, right? They didn't want people to know that their business was involved in cannabis, and they didn't want disputes to be public records because, you know, maybe it would shine a light on the fact that their business wasn't compliant with local licensing, or maybe they had some big shot investor that wanted his name out of the limelight for any reason. But that we're having less and less of those concerns now, and I think the press and the media are more used to thinking about cannabis companies as regular companies, and it's not such a big deal. Reporters aren't running around trying to chase down every single cannabis lawsuit and write a big front page story on it like they did a couple of years ago. So because of that, I think most people are going to be open-minded about settling their disputes in a public venue like a court. But most international disputes, at least in my opinion and experience, are settled via arbitration. And that just generally seems to be the preferred sort of contract methodology or stipulation to resolving a cross-border dispute. So to the extent you have, let's say, a US-Mexico intra-company investor dispute or something like that, the whatever relevant agreement we're talking about there, the investment or private placement documents, or maybe just the operating agreement or whatever it is that the investor has signed up for, may talk about an arbitral tribunal, and it may be pre-selected by the parties. It should be, if the contract's done right. And there are a number of them to choose from. And I would say that more often than not, you're going to see a trend with that in the first several years of cannabis, and probably going forward, just like any other internationally traded commodity.
Okay, and let's talk about let's move from the concrete perspective up again to the general view. What will happen? What will be the first things to happen when the law, Mexican law, goes through and passes by, and the federal? Yeah.
If we can think about the market in the next, we talk about 2 years maybe, right? What can we imagine that could happen in the next 2 or 3 years if the federal regulation in the U.S. goes through? What is gonna? I mean, it's just an exercise of imagination, but we would like to imagine a little bit how these blogs are gonna fit, or what are your conclusions on that? So if you can
Yeah.
give us some information about that, we'll be really happy to know more.
Sure. So I think what you'll start seeing right away is a lot more cross-border investment, not so much cross-border trade, right? So you'll see dollars going across the border. You'll see Mexicans investing in the U.S. cannabis businesses more, and you'll see U.S. citizens investing in the cannabis businesses more. And you'll see multi-state and multinational companies. You'll see companies that are situated in both Mexico and in the U.S., and you'll see more cross-border licensing, and you'll see all kinds of transactional stuff flowing across the border. But what you won't see as quickly is the actual cannabis itself going across the border, right? And that gets into what I was talking about earlier with like trade treaties and international laws and just the complexity of the changing regime at every single level. So I think if you see cannabis legalized federally, wide open for investment, I can't imagine there would be anything like a residency requirement for a foreign national investing in the U.S. cannabis. You'll see a lot of directly related and tertiary areas of law soften up, like immigration law. Immigration law is really problematic, even still today, for people trying to invest in U.S. cannabis because immigration law strictly forbids it, right? People can't come here to work in a cannabis company. People could theoretically, I think, under the current guidance, and I could ask one of our immigration lawyers about this, but they could be barred from entry into the U.S. for even investing $1 in a cannabis business. So that sort of stuff would be a big, welcome, helpful change when federal legalization happens in the US. And it's going to be some years beyond that when you see kind of a robust cannabis, pounds and pounds and kilos and metric tons of cannabis flowing across the borders.
I think both countries, and thinking about Mexico, we have a lot to do domestically, locally, before thinking about crossing borders, right? So even if that happens in a couple of years, I think we're going to be on the right time to do so. And this is something that I truly believe that is something that we don't have to be putting so much attention at this moment, because we have a lot to do right now. And I think if that happens 2 years, it's going to be perfect timing for both countries to meet in certain points.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I mean, it's already a really good time for investment and prospecting and companies moving to establish relationships early, to establish brands early. I mean, I know your guys' licensing is just about to ramp up. Ours is ramped up, at least at the state level in a lot of places. So there are opportunities right now for savvy people to get head starts. And especially before, it's kind of interesting, you know, with the US not having federally legalized cannabis, there's a lot more room for the little guy, right? For like the cottage industry, for new investors, for entrepreneurs, for smart people to get in where they're not blocked by like some, you know, to use the cigarette or the tobacco analogy, you've got these Philip Morrises and Altrias and stuff, and they sort of sit on those commodity markets because they're so hard to get in. The compliance costs are so high. They're taxed and regulated pretty extensively. Whereas cannabis now is a lot more wide open, and it's kind of a neat time for people to establish footholds, brands, business models prior to the whole thing changing and the big money coming in a couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect note to see, or to give the chance to small projects to grow, and maybe they will be acquired anyway by the big ones. But it's if not, well, competing will be really hard. So yeah, we assume that happens, and that's the same for Mexico. I mean, it will provide more possibility to local for local companies to grow before someone else come and just smash the whole market, right?
I agree with you guys. Yeah, I agree. It's a really interesting time. I think we'll all look back at this time and you're seeing a lot of stories being written right now, and people will look back 20 years from now, and some of the companies that are really, really big companies and some of the investors that have done really well will point to their head start in the year 2021 and in the year 2020, and they were there on the ground. And there will be people who don't do as well, and it's always like that. It shakes out the winners and the losers, but it's time to make a move for a lot of people, and we are helping people make moves, and it's a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. I agree with that.
And a guy, a really good partner of us, he said that we are just in the first innings. There is a lot of game to see. So
let's talk about the second inning. I mean, we were talking about when the federal laws in both countries unite, collide, and synergies can be done. But what's your, in your opinion, Vincent? What's the next step? I mean, you know that Mexico's market is opening. What do you see from the U.S. perspective that will be the next steps? Let's not go to the next 20 or 10 years, but rather this year and the next year. What are your perspectives in this short, medium term?
Sure. So I think the next step, I think U.S. investors, businesses, everybody is going to have to understand the Mexican system, and I understand it's being built right now, and the laws are kind of rolling out right now, and the regulations are rolling out right now, and they're going to have to understand it, and they're going to have to appreciate that the opportunity there may be greater than the opportunity of doing things at the state level in the U.S., right? They're going to have to say, okay, I really understand what this means now with Mexico having legalized cannabis federally. I understand how it works. And I understand if I put $1 here, here's what could happen, right? I think people are still sort of learning about that. It's been kind of exciting to watch week by week and month by month as these things move through the Mexican legislature and we start to understand the contours of the program. So I think, even in the next several months and later this year, you're just going to see more and more movement. And it seems like it's shaping up to be pretty business friendly. I don't know. Do you guys generally agree with that assessment? That's my layperson.
Yeah, well,
you're the experts.
Totally agree. And in this industry, every single month is like 3 or 6 months in any other industry. This is going so fast in many ways. And I think if you truly want to think in the future, maybe 2 years, 3 years, maybe it's a good way to start now, planning and trying to read the context of a new country, which I'm pretty sure that is going to be one of the biggest in the whole world for position, for economics, for population, because of the cost of labor. There are so many things that meld there, and well, that's why we are here, right?
Yeah. So I think, but I mean, big picture, people just have to understand it. The market's opening up right now. Once the market opens up and they kind of get, what their costs will be for all those things and how hard it is to get a license and how blah, 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 then I think, the market's there. It's a huge market. It's going to be huge, and people are excited about it. They just have to learn how it works.
Well, Vincent, this has been, as expected, of course, very insightful session. And we want to thank you again, not just as a participant in this summit, but as a business partner with Logic. The synergy between Harris and Logic is just starting as the industry, but we expect it to bear very, very fruitful and good results. We want to thank you again for your time, for being here, and for all these insights you've given us. And as we've been telling other presenters, Mexico is your home. And guys, Harris Brick is in Mexico. Bienvenido. So you know.
Bienvenidos.
You guys are great. Always appreciate working with you, and thanks for having me on. Thanks for everybody for watching and the good questions. I'll see you later.
Thank you.